Just a week ago, Ferrari was talking confidently of taking a 1-2 in the Hungarian Grand Prix and potentially going on to win every single race remaining in the 2022 F1 season. Yet here we are already picking apart another Ferrari failure, this time at the Hungaroring. And joining me, Glenn Freeman, to get into what Ferrari got wrong this time, and coming from Hungary, are Scott Mitchell and Edd Straw. So Scott, let's get straight into this. Can you firstly explain to us what was Ferrari's defence or explanation for the way it messed up the Hungarian Grand Prix?
Yeah, well, I asked Mattia Binotto straight away in his post-race media briefing why they ended up on the hard tyres, why it didn't work the way they expected, because this was the decision that completely destroyed Charles Leclerc's Grand Prix, and instead of winning, finished in sixth. And his argument was that the first and foremost, it's a matter of car performance. For some reason, the car wasn't working as well as they wanted it to, and that wasn't just on the hard tyre, that were on other compounds as well. But coming specifically to the hards, the justification was that once Max Verstappen had worked his way up into the periphery of that lead battle, into fourth place overall, once he went aggressive, Red Bull went aggressive on an early pit stop going for the undercut, Ferrari were basically spooked and wanted to cover off Verstappen, wanted to protect track position. That meant committing Leclerc to a 30 or 31 lap stint. The only tyre that they thought was going to be capable of doing that they had available to them was the hard, because they'd used the mediums on Leclerc's car up to that point. The mediums weren't available, the soft wasn't going to go the distance, it had to be the hard, and based on their estimates, their simulations, the hard should have been good enough to do that. Yeah, there would have been a bit of struggle with the warm-up early on, but they reckoned that 11 laps, they were very specific about this, 11 laps into that 30-lap stint was going to be the point where the hard became the better tyre. So there you go. That is me playing devil's advocate, but I have a feeling that someone else on this video is about to pile in and say that that's absolute rubbish.
Well, I can offer several facts to counter that position. Yeah, I certainly agree the car pace for the Ferrari wasn't great. In the lower temperatures, it wasn't so competitive. But that's kind of by the by. That's only relevant if you say they definitely threw away a certain victory. My point is that their strategy was just not well executed, particularly with Leclerc to have the best possible race time and the best possible position, which is what it's all about. So several factors. Only 9 drivers used the hards in the race. And given that everyone was running until late on, everyone had the opportunity to. The people who ran the hards were either those who had to, i.e. those who only carried one set of mediums into the race, so that's your McLarens, your Alpines, your Alfa Romeos. They had to use hards because they didn't have enough mediums. That was a mistake earlier in the weekend, or basically the desperate, which is pretty much Haas. They tried them, didn't really work. The other was Leclerc. So everybody knew the hard wasn't great. Now, Scott referenced the data there that Ferrari had. Obviously, Ferrari have far more data on the hard than I did. Well, did they? When did they run the hard? They didn't. They didn't run it on Friday, so they hadn't evaluated it. What they also didn't do is what Red Bull did. When they ran the hard briefly on the reconnaissance laps on Verstappen, they realised the warm-up was terrible and that Verstappen should start on soft. So that was a dynamic, responsive decision from Red Bull. Now, they then covered Verstappen's stop by putting Leclerc onto the hards, which he wasn't going to be able to hold position on. In fact, he wasn't able to hold position twice because Verstappen threw away that lead, and then he just said he wasn't worried because he knew Leclerc was so slow. Now, you go into a race with a certain set of resources, and tyres is one of them. They knew they either had to go onto the hards or use the softs. Now, Mercedes, say with George Russell, started on soft, so they got it out of the way. But that meant you need to optimise your time on the mediums, basically. And by shortening that second stint for Leclerc, when he was saying he wanted to stay on the mediums, that was a mistake. It's like they played all their cards, and then sort of halfway through the race, by the time they brought Leclerc in on lap 39 of 70, so still a long way to go, they thought, oh, suddenly this is a situation. And it was just a big mistake. They had the data from Alpines that were struggling. Yeah, Norris did an okay job on the hards. There was so much information there. Everyone knew the hard was not a tyre in the low temperatures in particular. Even in the high temperatures on Friday, I was speaking to Mario Isola on Friday from Pirelli, and he was saying, well, actually, the hard, it's slower and it's not even necessarily more durable because they're having a few little problems with it. So there was plenty of data and information. And I just think that it's a red herring to cite the car pace as the problem. The strategy was quite simply not correct. They should have been aware of the problem going into the race. We were, Every other team up and down the pit lane was aware of it, and it was only those who were boxed in who had to do it. Ferrari were the one team in a good position who voluntarily sent themselves down that cul-de-sac. And they can't say, well, we were down a cul-de-sac, without factoring in they sent themselves down there. So, yeah, just a tremendous mistake by Ferrari, pretty much from early in the weekend when they didn't try out the hards.
And as we've mentioned, this isn't a Ferrari one-off really in 2022. In fact, Ed, I think I've genuinely lost count of the number of times and the number of ways Ferrari have thrown away races and points this year. So where does this one rank among all the other Ferrari mistakes that we've had to pick apart already in 2022?
I think the fact that it's the latest one almost makes it the worst. It's not necessarily the one that had the biggest consequences, but it's just the fact that this keeps happening. And you just think, well, you can't keep saying, no, the strategy was fine when it clearly wasn't. Yes, Ferrari have certain disadvantages in that they do have a car that tends to be very strong in qualifying, whereas the Red Bull comes on strongly in the race. That always makes it a little bit difficult. Strategy is not magic. It doesn't make a car quicker. But Ferrari haven't been getting it right. Silverstone, Paul Ricard, Monaco. There's so many examples of this where they've shot themselves in the foot. And that's the problem. It's just one big mess that doesn't seem to be being sorted out. Every time it happens, we ask questions. Mattia Binotto says, no, it was all fine. It was the only thing we could do. It's just what happened. We don't need to change anything. And then you get to the next race, the same thing happens. And it's like, well, no, it's all fine. So just the same thing, history repeating itself. And I don't see much evidence they're learning from the mistakes. And I don't mean they need to change personnel or anything, but they need to change the way they're analysing information, the assumptions they're making, and also the decision-making process and the willingness to make snap decisions, a bit like the one I referenced that Verstappen and Red Bull made. Ferrari just needs to sharpen up strategically, or this will continue to happen.
And Scott, let's come back to you, because as well as kicking Ferrari, we have to praise Red Bull and Max Verstappen. You don't win the Hungarian Grand Prix from deep in the field by accident, do you?
No, not at all. And I think as much as this was a race that Ferrari threw away, and it was a race in which Ferrari looked like also rans, it was a race that Red Bull and Verstappen won and looked like exactly what they are, which is the inevitable champions of 2022. There's no way that Ferrari on this form, in this form as well, the way that they operate, as Ed was talking about in the previous answer, can beat Red Bull and Verstappen the way they are right now. They're just so far short of that standard, and Red Bull and Verstappen showed that here. I mean, that's why I'm going to sort of hint back to what you asked Ed about sort of how this mess ranks. Like, how do you lose a Grand Prix at a track that's notoriously difficult to overtake when your cars start second and third? The only car ahead of you is a car that you know you're quicker than, that's the Mercedes. Your title rivals are 10th and 11th. How do you lose that race? How do you not even get one of those cars on the podium in this race? Like Leclerc and Ferrari have now conspired to throw away more than 100 points between them this season through mistakes on the driver's side, strategy, reliability, all of that. They're finding so many ways to do it. So the extent of their implosion sometimes has often let Red Bull and Verstappen sort of steal in and just pick up wins just by being there. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense to them, to say that they haven't earned it, but they haven't had to win those races. This race, they absolutely won. There was nothing about picking up the pieces in this Grand Prix. This Grand Prix was a proper, we're the boss. You know, we're such a force right now. And when you get to the end of a Grand Prix like that, you think, how have they played their way into this? And then you review the race, and they just make every single decision is basically right. It's aggressive, but it's right, and it's well executed. I mean, I joked about this in our post-race podcast, but even Verstappen's spin was perfect. It was 360 degrees, he cracked on, and then just was able to repass Leclerc and win anyway. Even when he spins and makes mistakes, he kind of does it better than Leclerc. When Red Bull get it wrong, this weekend they got it wrong in qualifying. That's why Verstappen was so far down the grid in the first place. They still won the race. If you're Ferrari, and if you're a Ferrari fan, I would be really, really worried. There is no coming back from this before you even consider the massive extent of the points gap between them.
It was only about 4 seconds Verstappen lost to that spin. But the real shame is that Ferrari have produced a really, really good clever car, really good design. Everyone saw it at first and thought, well, that doesn't look quite right, but it was right. So they're just squandering it. I can tolerate some engine unreliability. We know they were playing catch up. We know there's an engine freeze. We know that they can make reliability fixes. So I kind of accept that. But it's just this execution that's so far short of the level you need to win a championship, which is the bar that Red Bull is setting, that's just consistently frustrating that team. And it's just so sad because we could have a really, really great championship season, great drivers, two cars that make their lap time in very, very different ways. But it's just turned into a little bit of a damp squib of a championship fight because Ferrari just keeps dropping the ball.